Hello, I'm Dr. John Wineland, and welcome to Restoration History, History of the Restoration Movement. And as I alluded to you in the introduction to the course, one of the things that we're going to cover here in Restoration History, we have to do a little bit of background on church history. And I assume most of you have not had a church history course, a survey of church history. And that puts you at a disadvantage in understanding Restoration history, because we need to understand the situation as it is in the 19th century and the 20th century, and especially on the frontier of America. And there's a lot of things that are brought over from Europe that they have to deal with. So church history then becomes very important to us. And this guy who is here, let's see, I got to go this way. All right. Where is he? Oh, he's here. There he is. Martin Luther. Martin Luther is very important to, and we'll be talking about him at least briefly here and somewhat more later on. So we're going to have a few lectures that deal with church history. But what I want to do today is just give you a little introduction to church history and give you a little introduction to kind of an outline of church history. So let's do that. Let's go ahead and get started with the history of Christianity, a brief overview of the history of Christianity. Now, one of the things that I always start this course with is this question to you. How did we get here? How did we get here? That is, if you say the church started in Acts chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost with the preaching of Peter, which I imagine you've heard about that, that's where the church begins, in Jerusalem. And guess what? They added 3,000 there to the others that were already there. And they were all together. There were not different groups. But if you take a look today, and I used to tell people, go take a look at the Acts chapter 2. How did we get there from today? And I used to tell people to go look at the Yellow Pages. I venture to guess that most of you don't even know what the Yellow Pages are, and probably have never seen one or certainly ever used one. Basically, the way it used to be, if you want to know somebody's phone number, you had to look it up in a book, a telephone book that had numbers. And in the back of that book, or in a separate volume that was also published at the same time, it's called the Yellow Pages. They're mainly ads. You want a plumber, you look under P for plumber, and here's a listing of 10 plumbers with their phone numbers, their address, or whatever. And you could call them up and say, hey, I've got a problem with my drain or my pipe or something, and they would, try to get them to come over and fix it. Well, the same kind of thing was there for churches. If you looked under C, it would be churches. You would find churches there alphabetically. And then under that heading of churches, you would find a whole list of all kinds of churches. Maybe Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, Episcopalians, Roman Catholics. The list could go on and on. Assembly of God, Nazarene, right? Moravian, even, right? So the question is, how did we get to these? Oh, I don't know. I've got some books in there that have lists of different groups, and you could there's a whole bunch of different Baptists. If you just say Baptist, there's a lot of different Baptists. You got American Baptists, Southern Baptists. You've got different kinds of independent Baptists and so forth. Now, that's just naming a few. So we have all these different groups. Where did it come from? It wasn't there on Acts 2. We don't see that. How did it get that way? That's what church history will tell us or help us understand, right? Is to know where that kind of comes from. All right, let's move on. Now, some people say, well, why should we study church history? Why should we study restoration history? It's a bunch of dead people. It's a bunch of old guys that are dead. What does it have to do with me, right? So this is this is what I want you to think about. Church history and history in general, the study of it can help. Now, of course, you expect a guy like me to say that, right? I teach history. I've studied history. Of course, I think history is wonderful and you need to study it. But I'm talking about for your life, you need to know history. And for our civilization, we need to know history. History gives us past examples so that we don't face things all alone. Now, for example, when it comes to church history, there have been conflicts in the church. You know, the church has faced conflicts since day one. And our modern conflicts, and I'm not sure what you think the modern conflicts in the church are. It wasn't too long ago, a lot of people were very concerned about worship style, I think we would call it today. The way in which you worship, even sing, how are you going to sing, what kind of songs are you going to sing, what sort of instruments are you going to use. You know, part of what you have to remember is that for many, many years, people used a hymn book. And they had maybe a piano or an organ. And they would sing to that. And they would have a song leader. They had a song leader, and then you maybe had a piano player. And then, you know, people would sing. Sometimes they would stand, sometimes they would sit. And you had in front of you the words. But you not only had the words, by the way, you had the music. And now I kind of miss not having the music because, you know, when you go to church now, they put it all up on the wall there on a screen, and you don't see the notes. You don't see the music. And that helps me to see the notes. I see which way the song is going. It also helps me to harmonize. We don't really do much harmony anymore in the church. Singing, harmony is, I guess, old-fashioned now. But at any rate, there have been conflicts over music and worship style. But, you know, that was nothing new. This guy behind me over here, Martin Luther, right there, he changed things. You know, the Roman Catholic Church, there was no congregational singing. For hundreds of years, people did not sing. You might find that strange, but that's the way they viewed it. And so, when Martin Luther came along, he put the congregation to singing. And he also began to use lyrics that he wrote that weren't just, you know, the church for centuries did not have congregational singing, and the music they did have, or any lyrics that they did have, were just scriptures. A text of a psalm, or something like that, set to music. And maybe it would be chanted, or perhaps sung in different ways. But normally by the priest or by someone there, not the congregation. And so Martin Luther said he wanted the congregation to sing. And he began to use popular music, popular in his day music, the tune, and then he would write his own lyrics. Okay? This was very controversial at the time. A lot of people didn't like it. And now I guess we consider that to be, you know, what it's not. I've heard people say it's not worship unless you're singing. They just call singing worship. And then when we get done with the singing, worship is over. Now, I think that's a misguided view, but that's for another day, perhaps. Now, what about culture and compromise? The church has had to deal with the culture for centuries, and we have to deal with our culture as well. I'll give you one example. Boniface, sometimes called the apostle to the Germans. He was sent to pagan Germans in Europe, basically what today would be Germany, that area of Central Europe, and he found people there worshiping trees. Yeah, worshiping trees. You ever wonder why we drag a tree into the house and decorate it at Christmas? Well, you might want to look into that. That's really a Germanic holdover of Germanic tree worship. Now, I'm not saying it's wrong to do that. I think we've kind of Christianized it. We have our own tradition about it now. But they used to actually decorate and worship trees. They didn't usually cut them down and bring them in their house, but they would go outside and do it. And so they had sacred trees. And so what Boniface ended up doing to try to reach the people is they had a sacred oak tree, and of Geismar, he cut it down. And he had it cut up into lumber, and he built a church building out of that oak. And this got people to come to the building because they wanted to worship the tree. And that's all that was left of that tree. Now, was that the best way for Boniface to do it? How did he know when the people showed up they were there to worship Christ or there to worship the tree? Well, those are questions that we would have to answer. But don't we do kind of the same thing sometimes? We use the trappings of modern culture, the music, the tunes, the games, the way we dress, all this sort of thing. We say we want to reach the people where they are. I think that's a good idea. But how far do we go? How much do we adopt the culture and adapt to the culture before we are a part of the culture? Peter called us a peculiar people, and that's not just because we're weird. He said we were supposed to be a peculiar people. We're to be in the world, but not of the world. So the question is, how much do we be in the world and not be of the world? Well, these are questions maybe for another class, for another day, but the church has faced these issues in the past, all right? So, let's move on. Also, conflict is nothing new in the church. Nothing new at all. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, conflict can strengthen us. Conflict can focus us. I remember growing up in the church, I used to hear about disputes. I used to hear that this person left. Why did the person leave? Oh, well, they didn't like the way the color they painted the wall, or they put in new carpet. They shouldn't have put in new carpet. Or they got a new piano, and guess what? This guy's mother donated the old piano. What's going to happen to the old piano? They're going to put it down in the basement for the kids to use in their kids' worship or something. These are all things that have led to conflict. Conflict is nothing new. The church has had conflict for centuries. And we can study the past, not only in the church, but in the world. Because history is our collective memory, we can now benefit from what people did and learned and how they operated in the past. All right? I don't know if you know anyone with Alzheimer's. I hope you don't have to deal with it, and I hope it's not in your family. It's a terrible, terrible disease, and it robs people of their memories. That's really what that disease does. That's the primary thing that it does. You could see your child, you could see your spouse, and you don't recognize them. Or you remember something that happened 40 years ago, but you don't remember what happened an hour ago. This is sort of the way we operate when we don't study history. We approach the world like this is the first time anyone's dealt with this. What are we going to do? Same in the church. So if we study church history, if we study history, then it's our collective memory. And of course you'd say, oh, you're a history guy. You think we ought to study history. Yes, I do. And I think it will help us face our problems as a society and as a church. Without it, it's like we have amnesia or maybe Alzheimer's. We have to face every problem as though it's never been dealt with before. All right, let's move on. I want to get to this outline now. We got our guy here. He's up in the ship. He's looking out, seeing what's ahead. Okay, so let's look. Let's get to it. There it comes. The first one is what we call ancient church history, or I tend to call it early church history. When did early church history begin? Some could say, well, it begins with the birth of Christ, maybe 5 BC, 4 BC. Some would say, no, it has to begin at 33 in Jerusalem when Peter preached the sermon. That's when the church begins. Okay, I'm not going to argue about that. But let's start at that point, and we'll go up to about 600 AD, about 590 AD. And that's what we're going to call early church history. It has 3 periods that we're going to delineate here. The first one is the very beginnings. The church has to begin. It begins there in Jerusalem. And it begins to spread, to Samaria, all right? And then to the uttermost parts of the world, as we read in the book of Acts. And so, as it spreads, it faces challenges. There's a lot of challenges it must face. And one of those is just the propagation of it, devising how to do it. Paul has to deal with the fact of, one of the first things they have to deal with, can Gentiles be Christians? And we probably don't think about that very often. But, it was Jews when it started, and it should just be for Jews. But then, of course, Peter had to be convinced that, no, it's not just for Jews. Well, Paul then begins to spread it out into the Roman world, faces problems there. The other problem that they face is persecution. In the beginning, the persecution is through the Jews. Remember, they don't accept Christ as the Messiah, and they feel threatened, and they feel that the Christians are heretics, and so they attack them. Later on, the Romans are convinced that Christians are not Jews, and therefore they begin to persecute them. And that persecution will last for quite a while. So that's the spread of Christianity. And then we get up to the first century, the end of the first century, which is the end of the first generation. That is, we're going to then reach a point where no one in the church directly met Jesus physically. When the Apostle John dies, he was most people believe, the youngest of the apostles. And when he dies in around 96, 97, somewhere in there, towards the end of the first century, then we have no one else who has a direct memory of talking with Jesus on earth. Well, we get to the second big period from about 100 to 313. This is where we face persecution, sometimes very intense, by the Roman Empire. But the other thing we face is heresy, false teaching. By the time we get to the end of the first century, there are questions there that maybe you don't have questions about. For example, how could Christ be fully divine and fully human at the same time? How does that work? And if he's fully divine and he's equal with God, why is he calling God his Father? How does that work? How does the Trinity work? Trinity is a difficult thing. I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East. I think, as I told you, I'm an archaeologist, so I've been in Jordan and Israel a lot, and I've been around a lot of Muslims. And I remember some of them asking me if I believed in God. And I said, oh, yes, I believe in God. And then they said, oh, well, do you believe that Jesus is God? And I said, well, yes, I believe that Jesus is God. And they said, well, you don't believe in one God then, you believe in two gods. At that point, I did not bring up the Holy Spirit as a part of the Trinity. But you can see that this can become an issue for the church. They had a teacher called Arius who was teaching that Jesus was subordinate to God the Father. Subordinate, not equal. Begotten, in a sense that God had no beginning, but Jesus did have a beginning. And so this kind of false teaching had to be addressed. It was addressed in various ways. But we see it being addressed towards the end of the New Testament. Also, the church had to face this. And then finally, after all this persecution and struggle, the church triumphs and becomes the major player, it becomes the dominant player, it becomes the victor, I guess you might say. They go from having a handful of people and being persecuted to actually having thousands, millions of followers and being the preferred religion of the Roman Empire. And that brings its own problems. You might say, oh, well, persecution's over, great. Everything's great. No, now you have to worry, are the people joining for the right reasons? You didn't have to worry about that before. Are they joining just to get ahead or to make money or to gain favor with the emperor? and maybe they're not true believers. At least this was one of the conflicts they had. Well, let's move on. Medieval church history, 590 to 1517. We're going to divide this up into 4 periods. Two big things that happened between 590 and 800 that the church has to deal with is the coming of the Germanic tribes. These are Germanic tribes from Europe, and they're moving from east to the west. They're pagan at first, but many of them are converted to a false form of Christianity. Arianism, I told you about Arius briefly. Arius teaches that Christ is subordinate. And so they're also being taught that Christ is subordinate. And so then when these Arian Christians, Germanic tribes, make their way to the west, they are not accepted by the other Christians that are there. And this leads to a lot of conflict because they say, well, you are not really Christians, you are heretics, and that sort of thing. And then, of course, Islam, the rise of Islam coming out of the Arabian Peninsula and just exploding in growth and taking over the Middle East, eventually North Africa and so forth. And these are the centers of Christianity. And we'll talk about that. Egypt, Israel, Palestine, Turkey. These are all centers of Christianity. They are going to be subdued by Islamic forces. Divisions east and west. Now, you may not think about that too much, but there is a whole church that's we might call the Eastern Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Serbian Orthodox, and so forth. And the church had been somewhat united, but here they are divided in 1054. They divide east and west. There's growing divisions in the west, from the west to the east, over theological things, over practical sort of how do we handle things, over even like when is Easter? When do we celebrate Easter? That's not agreed upon, and so forth. So we'll talk a little more about that. And then we see in the west the zenith of papal power. By zenith, I mean the height of it, the intensity of papal power. 1054 to about 1305. This is when the Bishop of Rome becomes mainly the power of the church in the West, and a whole lot of sort of theological, legal sort of things build around that, and the Pope becomes the leader of the church, which is based in Rome. And as they get that power, you know what they say about power. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so we start to see corruption coming in to the church, starting with the papacy, with monasteries, as monasteries became powerful. The other challenge, that not only corruption, but we see the rise of the nation states in Western Europe, the rise of France, the rise of England, and so forth. These are going to challenge the church. All right, let's move to the next one. Now to the modern period. By modern, you see that I'm kind of an ancient historian, so modern for me is 1517 to the present. We can divide that into 4 periods. The Reformation, obviously, and the Counter-Reformation. Critical in the history of the church with this guy, Martin Luther, over here. Martin Luther, I always point the wrong way. Martin Luther, and then how the Roman Catholic Church responds to that. So this is 1517 to 1648. Very important. Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, and so forth. And then we see the church facing intellectual challenges, rationalism. People are beginning to lose their faith in God and their faith in the church. And we also see many more divisions coming out of the Reformation. So up to this point in the West, we basically had the Roman Catholic Church. And in the East, we had the Eastern Orthodox Church. But now we begin to see a whole host of different groups. Those that follow Luther, those that follow Calvin, and so on. Those that follow Zwingli. And then we start to see, after this sort of intellectual problems that the church face, a revival of sorts, where people come back to the church and try to become more spiritual. But then we see the introduction of what we would call modernism or liberalism, where people, again, this is an attack from within the church, where they attack the Bible. They say it's not true. This is beginning towards the end of this period, and therefore we can't trust it. And so then that leads to the fourth period up to now, over about the last 100 years, roughly. The church has had a lot of troubles within and with society, not being accepted. You know, today, Christianity is not a pluralistic religion. Christianity is not accepting of other views. Christianity says there is a right way to do things and there is truth. And this is not very popular in our society today, and in fact it hasn't been for many years, to say that there is objective truth. And so the church has had to deal with a lot of issues within society, and we still do today. So that's a quick overview. That's a quick overview. And one thing that we've had in the church is we've had what you might call your head and your heart. Think about it. Your head and your heart. These become a symbol for intellectual or thought and emotions. The church has had to deal with that as well. And here is a little graph, right? A little chart. It's out of a book I've got. I found it instructive. You might find it instructive too. It's been very difficult for the church to stay sort of centered on the Bible, stayed sort of the center of balancing emotions and intellect. We tend to swing one way and we swing another. You know, we might say that early Christianity, Paul, so forth, teachings of Paul, quite intellectual, I suppose you might say, but also emotional. But as we move into the 2nd century, the Montanists, we don't have time to talk about here, but they were very emotional. And what happens is when you give up, when you focus on emotion, you tend to give up on some intellectual things. You say, well, we don't have to worry about that because we know, we feel this is right. This feels good. This feels right. It can't be wrong. And if somebody says, oh, wait a minute, I don't see that in the scripture. Where are you getting this? They say, oh, no. You just don't understand. You got to do the feelings, right? And then we see Gnosticism, 2nd and 3rd century, focuses on knowledge. It's all about knowledge. It's not about feelings. It's what you know. Then the monastic movement, very much kind of emotional. Back to scholasticism, which is very intellectual. Then to mysticism. And then the Reformation, quite intellectual. And then the Pietists and the Methodist movement, again, very emotional. Then we come back to liberalism, which is again very intellectual. And now in the 20th century, we've had a lot of emotionalism in the church, what we might call Pentecostal, charismatic kind of things. And so where is the church now? Are we going to swing back the other way? I imagine we will. That seems to be what we do. But we've been in this kind of mode for a while. Okay, so that's just something for you to think about. And I have two more screens, I guess, one more big idea to bring to you before we end with this discussion. I just want to mention the Roman Catholic Church and its teaching of sacraments. Sacramental theology becomes very important, especially in the history of the church, the history of the Reformation. It'll also become very important in the history of the Restoration movement, because we see that sacramental theology teaches that grace or forgiveness is imparted with a sacrament. And the Roman Catholic Church had 7, or I guess they still have 7 sacraments, right? Marriage and holy orders. By the way, they would teach that you should join a holy order unless you're going to get married. You should be married to a person, another good Roman Catholic, and have good Roman Catholic babies. Or you get married, so to speak, to the church and become a monk, a nun, a priest, something like that. So these holy orders, and marriage. That imparted to you God's grace. Then at the end of your life, they have what's called extreme unction or last rites, R-I-T-E-S, last rites. This you've probably seen in a movie or on television or something where they say somebody's not going to make it and they call in a priest and the priest comes in, kind of prays over the person, usually makes the sign of the cross on their forehead, usually anointing them with some holy oil, and that is this kind of final forgiveness for the person before they die. That's extreme unction, and unction has to do with anointing. Okay? And then there's confession and penance. This is where you confess your sins and you carry out penance. This brings you grace. And the penance is making up for the sins, doing something to show that you are sorry for what you have done. Confirmation, I don't know, we don't really do confirmation, but confirmation takes place roughly when you're about 12, 13, somewhere in there. You are confirmed in your faith. You go through a catechism, it's sometimes called, a training where you learn what everything means. And then you have a ceremony, and then you receive your first communion, or Lord's Supper, or Eucharist. These are interchangeable words. Lord's Supper, Eucharist, communion. They're really talking about the same event, maybe in a different way. And then baptism. So, if we think about this now, and we think about that all of these bring people grace in some way. They impart to them grace. Now, so this means that the Roman Catholic Church, from the time you're born, that's when you're baptized by Roman Catholic standards, like you see in the little image here. You are christened or sprinkled as an infant to the time you die, or right before you die, when you receive the last rites. You have these 7 sacraments. And then during your life, once you are confirmed in your faith, because, a little infant doesn't know what's going on, so we have to make sure you understand. Once you understand, then you can receive communion. Then communion is something you should do every week. And by the way, before you do that every week, you're supposed to go and confess and do your penance before you take communion. Then as you grow out of, adolescence into early adulthood, you have to choose whether you're going to become a monk, a priest, a nun, or get married. So you can see the church is involved in your life from the cradle to the grave in these 7 things that bring this. Now, this becomes controversial for a variety of reasons. We'll talk more about it later. But what I want to emphasize here is this guy behind me over here, Martin Luther. He, of course, began as a Roman Catholic, and he began as he was a monk. He had become a monk. And he ends up leaving mainly because of the corruption in the church. And he begins to see what he feels is destructive teaching. So eventually he will leave, and his followers come to be called Lutherans, although he doesn't really envision starting a different group, but he does. He rejects 5 of these sacraments. He keeps 2. 6 and 7 he keeps, the Lord's Supper and baptism. He says those are efficacious. Those provide mercy and grace to people. So that when you take the Lord's Supper, he was very much believed that when Jesus says, "This is my body and this is my blood," that's what he meant. And somehow the body and the blood of Christ are there. They're with the substance of the Lord's Supper. That's called consubstantiation. Whereas the Roman Catholic Church believed that the essence of the elements, the wine and the bread, changed into the body and the blood of Christ. That's transubstantiation. And then he also believed that baptism brought efficacious, that you needed to be baptized. Now, he also taught infant baptism at that time. But when we get to the Reformation, we just talked about Luther. He rejects 5 and keeps 2 of the sacraments, keeps the Lord's Supper and baptism. But Zwingli And Calvin is the guy there with the beard that you hipster guys are all jealous of. And then Zwingli is the guy there with the interesting hat. Zwingli and Calvin will, Zwingli has a big meeting with Luther to try to bring the two movements together, but they divide over this. They divide over the Lord's Supper and baptism. And Luther says, this is my body, this is my blood. And Zwingli says, no, these are symbolic. And so why this is important for Restoration history is that today it's very unusual for people or a group to hold to the fact that baptism is efficacious. Most Protestant groups hold that baptism is only symbolic. It's just an outward sign of an inward faith. It has nothing to do with your salvation. It's just something that you do out of obedience. These are all different ways of putting it. And so this becomes a major issue in the Restoration movement. So we'll talk more about it. But here are the big players. Luther at the top, John Calvin with the funky beard, and then Zwingli, that I'm kind of hiding him. Let me move over here so you can see Zwingli better. There you go. All right. So I hope this stuff makes sense to you. I hope that you have learned a little bit today. If you have any questions, please send me an email and I'll try to respond at that time. All right. Have a great day. Bye-bye.